So, good evening. Good evening and a warm welcome to you here to ESMT Berlin in the former headquarters of the Supreme Governing Council of the GDR. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here to the discussion on transatlantic relations with Ambassador Tony Gardner and the former Vice-Chancellor, German Vice-Chancellor Sigmar Gabriel, the current chair of the Atlantik-Brücke. Very warm welcome from our side. And I think the topic and also the timing of this discussion couldn't be more up to date and more relevant looking ahead just actually a little bit less or maybe quite for a week. And in particular, looking at the current status of the German-US relationships on the political side, but obviously also on many other dimensions that come with it. When you look at the economic relationships, when you look at the agreement in Paris on climate or the following of the climate agreement in Paris, when you think of the digital economy and climate change and many other topics that come together. In particular, I think it's very important to have this discussion at this point of time, given that while this transatlantic cooperation, in particular also on the private level, remains very strong, it is endangered on the political side. I think there's no hesitation to say that at this point of time, the relationship between the United States and Europe, between Germany and the United States, is probably not at its easiest point of time in history. So therefore, it's very important to get insights on what can be done, what can be improved. And in particular, it's a great honor and delight to have Tony Gardner with us, in particular also with the insights from his latest book, Stars with Stripes, The Essential Partnership Between the European Union and the United States. I think the title already says a lot of what is needed and what should be done, which Tony Gardner will discuss with Sigmar Gabriel and which will be moderated. And I'm also very happy to welcome Sarah Kelly from Deutsche-Welle to moderate our discussion today. Maybe just a few words. I know many of you know this building, many of you know the institution. We are here at our campus, as I said, in the former headquarters of the Supreme Governing Council of the GDR. I always like to say that this is maybe one of the nicest ironies of history, of German history, that what used to be the headquarters of socialism on German soil is now home to a privately run, privately operated business school with students, with faculty members from all over the world. We have now more than 70 different countries represented among our students, almost 20 countries represented among our professors. And it's really, you could say, one of those places that benefited a lot from what used to be a very strong and powerful cooperation between the United States and Europe, and in particular Germany. So therefore, for us, it's very important to have this and to use this building as a platform for the exchange between academia, politics, business, to really get to questions of current concern, of questions that really are important. And I think there's no hesitation and there's no doubt that the discussion today is of such fundamental importance, and thus we are very much looking forward to that. In particular, it is a delight and honor for us to cooperate in this event with Atlantik-Brücke. Atlantik-Brücke in particular standing for, I think, what Tony Gardner writes in his book, or what the title of the book says, essentially for the stronger cooperation between Germany, between Europe and the United States. And in that sense, what Atlantik-Brücke has in mind, what its mission is, lies or squares very well with the mission ESMT has, which is to develop entrepreneurial leaders who think globally and act responsibly. So really to take an international approach also to those who are aspiring leaders or maybe even current leaders in global organizations and companies. So in that sense, thank you very much to the Atlantik-Brücke, and in particular, a very warm thank to Alexandra Oetker, who initiated the event tonight, and without her, we wouldn't have been able to really have the event in this hopefully great discussion that lies ahead of us. With this, again, a warm welcome from my side, and I'd like to pass over to David Daisner, the Executive Director of the Atlantik-Brücke, to share his views with us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, also a very warm welcome from my side. I know you have all been eagerly waiting for a long lineup of welcome remarks, so I will keep that very brief. Just a very brief thank you from Atlantik-Brücke for that great partnership. Actually, this morning, Chairman Sigmar Gabriel and us, we just presented a survey, a study on what the Germans think about the upcoming election, and I think there was actually some positive content really in that study, and it was again kind of confirmed that the majority of Germans really think that the transatlantic partnership, is so far more important than the partnership we have to other countries. So it's very deeply rooted, and it was kind of, against that widely held belief that the majority of Germans, propose a kind of equidistance thesis that was not confirmed in our study, which was a positive signal. Anyway, in that context, our chairman said one of the strengths, the real strength really of the United States is to form alliances. And I think the same actually applies to Atlantik-Brücke. We always get stronger and more powerful when we form our alliances, and that applies in particular to our great partnership here on that occasion with ESMT, for which we are very grateful. So Professor Rocher, thank you again for your hospitality, and of course also for the technical equipment, which enables us to include not only the very few people here in the room, but also those who join us here today digitally. I already had the great opportunity to spend some hours this afternoon with Ambassador Gardner. Tony, thank you so much again for making your way here to Berlin, which was a bit of a challenge given the current pandemic situation. It's great to have you, and of course, also a brief thank you again to our Chairman Sigmar Gabriel, who spends the entire day with us here today in Berlin to support Atlantik-Brücke and our activities. And of course also a particular word of gratitude to our member Alexander Oetker, who actually initiated this event. Thank you so much for your support, and with that I would like to hand over to you, and you will introduce Ambassador Gardner in more length. Thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome to everybody from my side as well, especially to you, Tony, to you, Mr. Gabriel, and to you, Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for moderating tonight. It will be a pleasure and probably a highly interesting discussion. Mr. Gabriel, I don't have to introduce you because everybody knows you. So just thank you very much to be here as a top-class discussion partner with Tony Gardner. When the end of last year, Tony told me about the coming up publication of his new book, the question arose with whom one could present this work, this highly interesting work. I read it, it's worthwhile. According to Tony's motto, building bridges, I come to that in a second, the decision was in fact not too difficult. Who could be a better partner than the ESMT? Berlin, with an outstanding performance, being the highest ranked business school in Germany and top 10 in Europe. With students from all over the world, building bridges between so many different nationalities is essential and is probably definitely part of this success story. Thank you so much, Jörg, for having us here tonight under the wonderful guidance of Martha Ilbrock. Martha, without you, nothing would work. Thank you so much for your always helpful and friendly support. The choice of the second partner was even more obvious since Atlantik-Brücke carries the word bridge in its name. Under the presidency of Sigmar Gabriel, the fantastic presidency of Sigmar Gabriel, you were the reason why I joined in, by the way, and with Dr. David Daisner as an extremely efficient, competent, as well as sympathetic executive director, I quote, Atlantik-Brücke follows its target of building bridges between Germany, Europe and America on all levels and beyond party lines in an outstanding way, which is even more important nowadays than it was ever before, probably. Thank you again, Mr. Gabriel, for your presence tonight, and thank you, David, for your extremely professional performance in organizing this event. Now a few words to you, Tony. Before we met first time in April 2015 in Brussels, I had heard a lot about you already. You had the reputation of a highly respected, extremely well-connected ambassador who by all means wanted to contribute to broadening the EU-US relationship. Building bridges, that's what I said before, was your motto, a motto which you and Sandra, your wonderful Spanish wife, underlined in an impressive way when decorating your residence in Brussels. I remember all the a lot of walls were covered with fantastic large photographs of impressive bridges from all over the world. And you always took, all your guests you took along to show these bridges and make clear what the intention was behind. Already your father, Richard Gardner, professor of Columbia Law School, had been ambassador once to Italy under Jimmy Carter and once to Spain under Bill Clinton. You, as a major fundraiser for President Obama, you were appointed by the President as EU ambassador in October 2013 and started your mission in February 2014. The period you served in Brussels was extremely a turbulent one, which one can see in your book and everybody knows. The Ukraine-Crimea crisis, the Paris Climate Agreement, the nuclear deal with Iran, the Brexit decision, to name just a few. But the affair of your heart was one, it was TTIP. In your testimony as future EU ambassador before the Senate on October 31st in 2013, you noted that one of the most important objectives of your mission would be, quote, to help conclude an ambitious transatlantic trade and investment partnership that will position our economy for success in the 21st century. It is still needed. I remember the dinner we had at my place, by the way, in April 2016, with you as a guest speaker on TTIP. It was right. It was a highly interesting evening. Your Secretary of State, Mr. Gabriel, was there, and Jörg, you have been attending as well. The evening was highly interesting because on rather short notice, I remember Obama decided to come over to the Hanover Fair with the hope of perhaps rescuing TTIP. We all know that it did fail. And it was extremely hard also for you, Tony, to accept that the endless negotiations ended without conclusion in end of 2016. And even worse, and that's where we come to the present now, President Trump skipped any further negotiations on any free trade agreement with the EU and went into the opposite direction instead. He initiated a severe trade conflict with the European Union. Since over 60 years, American politics have supported European integration, seeing the USA and the EU as close allies in many contexts, as for instance free trade, climate change, global internet governance, and others. The obsession of Donald Trump to break any agreement made by President Obama, his incendiary rhetoric and controversial policies driven by hatred and egocentrism, is raising fears and mistrust on both sides of the Atlantic. Yesterday's nomination of Judge Barrett, just 1 week before the elections, is a meaningful example of the state of American politics under Donald Trump. In your new book, Stars with Stripes, you call for a reversal of all of these politics. For you, the EU was always a valuable American ally. Being also involved in the Biden campaign, we are looking forward to your comments on a possible agenda for US-EU relations under a potential Biden administration. Let's hope that the legendary American dream will be saved on November 3rd before turning into an American nightmare. Thank you, and we are very much looking to the discussion now.
Tony, you're the guest.
No, I think you follow her. You sit.
Okay. Wo wollen Sie wen haben?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Kelly. We're going to begin with some comments from Ambassador Gardner about his book, some insights, and then thereafter kick off our conversation. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's very good to be here. And I first wanted to start with some thanks. I'll be brief, but I really need to say thank you, Alexander, above all to you for your patience for pulling this event together. It wasn't easy, I know. Thank you to the business school, Professor Jörg Rochel, ESMT. Thank you to Atlantik-Brücke. Thank you, Sigmar. Thank you as well for the moderation in this event. We are meeting on the eve of an important event. But it's not just two candidates who are on the ballot. I think the nature of US democracy is on the ballot. It's the future of democracy and the values that we share, both in Europe and the United States. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. Even Joe Biden, the man I've worked with for a long time, as I was ambassador, even before when he was senator, has termed this election a battle for the soul of our country, whether or not we respect the independence of our judiciary and our media, whether we're a tolerant and open society. That's what's on the ballot, and that's what made me join this election. When Donald Trump was elected, I left my office as instructed at noon Eastern Standard Time, January 20th, 2017. But I didn't cry into my soup, as they say. I drove off to Bruges, to the College of Europe, where I taught. And then I went to the European University Institute in Florence. Two pretty nice places. And I remember opening the windows of the house that we were renting, and I would see these views of cypress trees and rolling hills. And I would drive the car, the Alfa Romeo Spider that belonged to my mother, to the European University Institute. And I used to say with my wife, "Thank you, Donald, for making this happen." I wrote the book during the 8 months. Why do I write the book? Well, I thought somebody would have to describe what we've done together as partners. Not an academic book. There are lots of really good academic books. But a book from someone who has lived it in the trenches. And I felt I had lived it in the trenches, not only as ambassador to the EU, but I was in the Clinton White House. I was director for European affairs back in a long time, 1994, 1995. I had lived in Brussels. I had worked at the European Commission. And it's been my professional life, and I believed in it. So I decided to write the book. And my daughter, who was then 13, I think at the time, she said, "Daddy, don't write this book. It's going to be boring. No one's going to read it. And by the way, you should focus on making money to pay for my school fees." So that's the kind of girl I brought up, And I realized it was going to be hard to write a book that makes the European Union interesting. Tom Friedman, one of our great journalists, said once, memorably, the best way to make someone fall asleep when reading an article is put the words European Union in the title. So I ignored that advice. And the book essentially is as follows, to describe the essential partnership between the United States and the European Union in 9 different sectors. In trade and economic affairs, so not only our negotiations in TTIP, which unfortunately failed, I remember we had some great exchanges on that, but also digital economy and data privacy, but also security, law enforcement, and military security, and energy security, and sanctions, importantly. And I also talk about what I call saving the planet, our climate change negotiations, and foreign aid and humanitarian assistance, and of course I talk about Brexit. But let me just say a few words quickly about why I joined the Biden campaign day one, even before day one. As I said, I've known him and I respect him, but not only for his experience, but because of his values. I felt the country needed to be pulled together. I'm not naive. I'm not saying we're going to heal all of the rifts. We're a very polarized society right now, more so than ever before, or certainly since Eisenhower, according to the polls. 87% of Republican-leaning voters think Trump is doing a good job, 6% of Democratic voters. That gap has never been bigger. We're a polarized society. But I believe that Joe Biden has the characters to help heal us in terms of his belief in tolerance in our democracy, and as senator, he's worked across party lines. And I have been helping the campaign, doing some fundraising, but principally helping on the policy side, running some of the working groups, particularly on the EU, which I run, the trade group, West European group. And the message is clear. Should we be lucky, you know, on election day, we have policies ready for day one, first 100 days, first year. But I'm not saying this is in the bag. It's not a done deal. I am concerned. I don't think we're repeating the same errors from 4 years ago, but I am concerned for all the reasons we can talk about in terms of the mail-in ballots, right? And then let me also be clear, the work that we're doing in these working groups is informed by a couple of major thoughts. First, we need to focus on what's readily implementable, ready to do quickly in the first 18 months before the midterm elections. So no big grand schemes that are going to take a long time. And no TTIPs, by the way, no super ambitious trade deals. What can we do quickly? First, it's going to be really important if we win to prove that our way, the old way, of respecting rules, of respecting international organizations and multilateralism, and working with allies, by the way, yields better results for the United States and for the middle class included than Donald Trump's way of breaking those rules, of undermining institutions, of insulting allies. And that is going to be super important, because if we fail in making that case, I think we will face a more virulent form of demagogy and populism in 4 years, whether it's Donald Trump or Ivanka Trump, right? Donald Trump is not going away. So this is what's informing our work. And that means a lot of the proposals I've seen in our working group have been discarded. By the way, I speak as a private citizen, clearly, right? I'm not speaking for the campaign. So much is at stake. Now here I'll be hopefully pretty brief. I want to leave the key messages that there is a wonderfully broad, rich agenda of things for us to do. Let's start with the existential threat to our climate. We've wasted now 4 years. And the chapter that I describe in the book goes back 30 years, which was unusual in the book, 30 years. But it was important because during the 8 years of Obama, we had an unusual moment of alignment. In the 70s, the United States was actually leading on many issues of environmental protection, and some EU member states were behind. And then the EU was the leader in promoting. And then finally, we had these 8 years, and we got to the Paris Climate Accords. I think the US played a particularly important role getting China involved. EU was always very ambitious, pushing the agenda and bringing in developing countries. We were partners. And there is no way that not only can we save Paris, but actually make it more stringent, effective, right, if we don't work together. Because the hole that we're in is a lot deeper than it was. You've seen what Biden has said about the green economy. He's been very ambitious, $1.7 trillion of spending over 10 years on renewables, on energy efficiency, on the circular economy, on removing carbon from the atmosphere. And he has pledged to make the United States carbon neutral by 2050. There's so much we can do together also in trade-related measures to combat climate change. For example, by relaunching, importantly, the so-called Environmental Goods Agreement to eliminate tariffs on green goods, and also on a potential carbon border adjustment mechanism, essentially a tax on imported goods, polluting goods from countries that don't respect their obligations. On sanctions, I write about this in my book. There is no way that we could have implemented biting sanctions on Russia or Iran if we had not worked together so well in the past. It is an unsung success story. And this administration doesn't understand that actually working with the European Union can advance American interest effectively. And in no more clear way is this true as in trade in China. Why aren't we working together and leveraging our joint power to force China to change its policies with regard to investment and market access, particularly? There's no doubt that WTO needs reform after 30 years in many sectors. But why has this administration believed we, the United States, can do this alone? We're the big gorilla in the room. We don't need the EU. We're going to negotiate with China. It hasn't made any sense. And by the way, the results speak for themselves. The trade deficit, 1 criterion has gone up with China, not down, up. Donald Trump is saying we don't like the fact that the Chinese economy, the Chinese state is weighing so heavily on the economy, and yet we're asking them to buy more from us. It doesn't work. We have to address the structural imbalances. So on trade, there's so much to do. I just mentioned one other thing, dear to my heart, it's very technical, but standards. Siemens, I think it was Werner von Siemens said, he who writes the standards, the rules, rules the world. And it's so true. The Chinese have identified standard-setting organizations as critical. They now control at least 4, to my count, technical standard-setting organizations. And they know the importance, because once they write the rules, it advantages their exporters. We have to do a better job together in setting standards and values around the world, in areas like facial recognition, in video surveillance. We have to settle the Airbus-Boeing dispute. It's been going on too long, 16 years. The only people who are benefiting are the lawyers and the Chinese who are pushing their own aircraft. On the digital economy, so much to do, especially now that the EU is changing, amending its e-commerce directive and introducing a Digital Services Act. On taxation, I hope and believe that there's a deal to be done whereby the EU hits the pause button, and the member states hit a pause button for their digital taxation system, and we re-engage the OECD for a global agreement on how we tax firms in the digital economy. We know the current rules are not fit for purpose. They're based on physical presence. We all know in a digital economy, you don't need physical presence to sell and to make profits. So on taxation, I hope we can engage in good faith and get a deal. There is so much work to do on ensuring the integrity of our elections. And here I mean the role of online platforms particularly, and combating illegal, harmful speech online, and enhancing the transparency and accountability of platforms. For the last 4 years, the EU has been the de facto sole regulator, almost the sole regulator, of Silicon Valley. That cannot be right. The political winds are changing, and I think we have an opportunity in the next 4 years to work together on these critical issues. Quickly, on privacy, not an easy subject, particularly in Germany. I was one of the negotiators. Privacy Shield, the agreement that allows data, personal data, to move from Europe to the United States, has been found invalid. We knew there was a risk, and now we have to work to find some kind of a successor agreement. Not easy, but hopefully one of the steps is to have federal privacy legislation in the United States. Other areas, quickly, for clear cooperation necessary, as it was in the past, anti-corruption, health, human rights, good governance, words that Donald Trump barely has used. With China, as John Bolton said in his book, he was willing to sell away human rights concerns in order to get a trade deal. When he didn't get the trade deal, suddenly human rights became important. We should have been cooperating on this coronavirus crisis, US and the EU particularly, but this president once again thought we don't need to work with allies. We don't need to work with Europe. And there's so many aspects to this problem, trade and movement and stockpiling and research and so forth. We should be working together on supply chain resilience and reducing our over-dependency on particularly raw materials, not just on pharmaceuticals, but also on raw materials like rare earths. And then, there's a broad range of things where we should be, and I think we would be, working together. If Biden is elected, I believe quickly, perhaps first day, declaration of support for the European Union, declaration of support for European integration, declaration of support in favor of NATO, the linchpin of Transatlantic alliance, which has been weakened because of this administration's policies. I won't talk about Brexit. I've lived it. Everyone's bored by it. Europe needs to move on. It's the biggest own goal I've seen in my lifetime. And all of the analyses that we did under the Obama administration, which were intensive, we looked at all the areas of our interaction with Europe. Our conclusion was that in almost every area, Brexit would be negative for the United States, for Europe, and for the UK. That analysis, I believe, is proven to be correct. The last thing I'll say in this is that here's a dramatic difference. Donald Trump has only believed that the US-UK link is important. He was a cheerleader for Brexit. Joe Biden believes that the triangle of relationships, US-UK, UK-EU, US-EU, all have to work together, and you will see statements to that effect. We need to seize the day. That's the message. There is a huge agenda. We can do it, and it needs to be quick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gardner, for kicking us off, for those insights from your book. I know we look forward to hearing a whole lot more now over the next hour as we kick off our conversation. You really framed it quite well. This is the battle for the soul of the nation. The world is watching. The transatlantic partnership is very much at stake. In fact, over the next hour, we're going to be examining the central question: transatlantic relations, will they improve after the American presidential election? We will be looking at the current and the future state of the relationship, what the vision and the action plan, you mentioned a bit about that, should be over the next 4 years under either Biden or Trump, and what can be realistically achieved, especially on the central pillars of the relationship: trade and security. How can both sides work together toward restoring trust? Will both sides want to work together when it comes to restoring trust? So a lot of questions to be answered over the next hour or so. A quick note before we get started. There's the opportunity for everyone who is physically here to ask questions in this conversation. You notice the microphones that are in the aisle. So when I open the floor, do feel free to approach the mic if you do have a question. For those who are joining virtually, you can also send your questions to the following email address, which is socialmedia@esmt.org. Again, that is socialmedia@esmt.org. Mr. Gabriel, I'd like to ask you for your reaction to what we have heard from Ambassador Gardner. And also, if you can just set the stage for us. This has been framed now as the battle for the soul of a nation. What if Donald Trump wins that battle next week? What does it mean for the transatlantic relationship in your view? Is Germany prepared?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and, of course, for Tony Gardner's speech and his book and his insights. Tony, listening to you, my German fellows could maybe think, okay, let's cross fingers that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States and then everything is fine again. I'm a bit skeptical. Not because I'm not hoping that Joe Biden will be the next president, that I would agree to Mrs. Oetker. I would say more than 80%, maybe more than 90% of our population is hoping for the best, and some of them are preparing for the worst. But maybe the German citizens are watching and looking more to the United States elections than to their own elections next year. So people have, of course, the feeling that there's something at risk. And this is more than some difficult issues we have to negotiate. I mean, looking back to the Transatlantic Cooperation, it's not the first time that we have, on specific items, difficult opinions. I mean, the first pipeline the Americans opposed sanctions on was in 1962, and then in 1980, and of course we had difficulties when it comes to Vietnam, to Chile, to the second Iraq war, or to the debate about NATO. But we overcame all these difficulties because we had a feeling and a political opinion where we say, what kind of difference we will have, there's one thing which we have in common, and this is the idea how societies should develop, the idea of democracy, of the individual freedom of people, and that it's necessary to join hands among democratic societies around the globe. Personally, I would say this is also the right idea for the 21st century. I don't think that bowling alone is a pleasant game for Europe or for the United States. But I don't think that Donald Trump is the only reason why we are in such a difficult situation. First, sometimes I think Trump is a kind of excuse for Germans and Europeans not to confront themselves with the real challenges of Europe. I mean, the difficulty on financial and economic issues between North and South in Europe, the struggle about the rule of law between East and West Europe, the idea what should be the way Europe should develop during the next 10 years, which is where we have very difficult ideas in the European Union. Nothing, or the lack of capabilities in a common foreign policy or defense policy. Nothing of these difficulties in the European Union has something to do with Donald Trump or with the White House or with the US. Whenever we are pointing with one finger to the US, there are three fingers pointing back to us. So first thing I would say, whoever will be the president of the United States, there is a lot to do on homework on our side. Because even if Joe Biden would be the president, and of course he's much more interested in forming alliances, partnerships, transatlantic cooperation, at the end of the day, it depends on our weight for international politics if we are a reliable partner for the US. A European Union which has nothing to say in the tech debate, which could lose an economic weight, or which is not able even to be active in our direct neighborhood in the north of Africa or in the Middle East. I mean, the most European-friendly American president will have asked himself, okay, what's the result of our cooperation with those Europeans? And look to your country. In some years from now, the majority of the American citizens do not have any European rules. They will have Latin American roots, Asian roots, African roots, but not European roots. They will look to Europe with less sentimentality than many others did in the past. So first, what I would like to say is, in German we say, we are looking like a rabbit to the snake. I think we have to do our own homework and not only looking what's happening after the US election. Second, I don't think that we will jump back to the so-called good old times of transatlantic partnership, because the world has changed. And of course, America has changed. By the way, in our interest. The United States of tomorrow will be less European and much more Pacific orientated. And that's, by the way, it's in our interest, because we as Europeans, we do not have the weight, we do not have the power to balance the world in this part in the Indo-Pacific. The United States is the only Western power who have the capabilities, I would say not to corner China, not to put China under house arrest. It's impossible to arrest a country with 1.4 billion citizens. By the way, the first time I entered this room was when the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder invited the Prime Minister of China, Zhu Rongji, and we had dinner in this room. So it's an interesting, it's not coming home. Yeah? So it was not only the State Council of the former GDR, it was the Chancellor's office and after reunification. But I would say the United States are different because geopolitical developments are different. The Atlantic is no longer the gravity of the world. It's the axis of power, the axis of trade, the axis of military power had shifted partly from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific, and the Americans are following that. Only we Europeans, we think, it was a nice time when the Americans did all the dirty jobs. It was wonderful, because if it went well, we paid. If it went wrong, we had something to blame. somebody to blame. Mostly we did both, paying and blaming. And it was very easy for us. And now we are entering a much more difficult and stressing century where the United States, of course, under a president like Joe Biden, will have a lot of interest in joining the traditional alliances, but they will also challenge us to do more. And so what is the biggest, for me, the biggest difference between Trump and the Democratic president? I mean, both, it's bipartisan in the United States, how they think about China. It's bipartisan how they think about Nord Stream 2 or Russia. Bipartisan when they are debating about the trade deficit. So the specific conflicts will not fade away only because we are getting a new president. But Trump is the first American president who ignores the real multiplier of force of the United States, and that was the capability to form alliances. I mean, China or Russia, they didn't have any ally, and they don't have today any partner. They have sometimes dependents, okay. But to form alliances, this was the real capability of the United States after the Second World War, and it was the multiplier of force. And Trump is a person who ignores this multiplier of force. For him, it seems that the world is an arena, and the big guys in the arena should make bilateral deals, and the rest have to follow. I would say it's maybe the same idea about the world than Vladimir Putin has, and Xi Jinping has, and maybe also Erdogan. Something like Yalta 2.0. where there are spheres of influence, and the big guys, they are organizing the rules, the rest have to follow. That's exactly the opposite of the European Union. That's the opposite of our transatlantic idea. That's the opposite of the former liberal order, which was organized by the United States. And that's the reason I hope that Biden will become the next president of the United States, because he will be again somebody who knows that alliances are in the national interest of the United States. He has a much broader perspective what national interests are, and not a narrow perspective like the current president. I don't think that all the difficulties will be, no, I mean, he will challenge us, and for good reasons, but as a partner and an ally, and not as an enemy. And that's the reason I hope that Biden will win, hopefully on the evening of the 3rd of November, and not only 5 or 10 days later.
Ambassador Gardner, your response to that, because it's certainly palpable, I would say. I mean, I have observed it. Transatlanticists really have their hopes pinned on Joe Biden. But as we've heard Mr. Gabriel illustrate here, a lot of the issues are not going away, and they are indeed bipartisan. So what would a Joe Biden presidency change, not only in terms of tone, not only in terms of language, but in terms of actual substance, actual policy, bringing the alliance back together?
Well, hugely. I think we're saying the same thing, although in different ways. You know, in my book, I quote a Zulu saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's the reality. So I'm not a naive person saying everything's going to be fine, the issues are going to go away, we've never had problems before. I arrived at my post March 2014, just after the eavesdropping and Snowden, you know, issues with the mobile phone of Chancellor Merkel and so on. That was not an easy time. We got over it, thank goodness. And we had the Iraq War and so on. So we've had moments before, but we're saying the same thing in a different way. Yes, the economic weight of the world is shifting. Yes, we have to recognize it. But that's exactly why we need to leverage our joint power. That's exactly why. That's realpolitik. It's not, you know, just hot air. And that's exactly why we should be working together on WTO reform, on forcing the Chinese to the table. The Chinese are terrified that we actually work with our allies, that we actually work together in setting standards, enforcing changes in market access. You know, in changing the rules so that they can't get away with their old practice of infringements, and it takes such a long time for the ruling to be handed down, the damage is done, right? Or the new brand of state-owned enterprises, state-owned capitalism in China, breaching WTO rules. So I would say that it's precisely because of the realities of the world, the fact that we are relatively declining, not in decline, but relative to other parts of the world that are rising, that we need to work better together. So I think that's an argument that not only the Biden White House would be supportive of, but also a Europe. You know, it's always difficult, you're right, Sigmar, to explain to an American administration, what is the EU? How does it work? I was at the table at US-EU summit meetings, and I could see...
It's, by the way, difficult to explain to
here. I looked into the eyes of the people on my side of the table, and they would sometimes look at all the other people on the other side of the table, and they would say, well, who are these people? Who do they represent? Why are we talking about some of these issues? But the short answer is, a lot of substantive change will happen, because we have to.
What does each side need to do now going forward? And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Gabriel, because one of the big issues that often comes up when you speak with the Americans is the issue of burden sharing. In the past couple of days, we've heard from the German Defense Minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who has essentially said that Germany needs to be more of a strategic giver, needs to do more when it comes to defense in its own backyard, needs to do more in order to meet those spending goals on defense as well. What can Germany offer, you think, to this next administration, be it Trump, be it Biden?
The first mistake is to say we have to do something because the Americans are asking us.
But how do you show that you're a reliable partner?
Debate. Sorry, that's the first mistake of the defense debate, because there are European interests that Germany is doing more. It's not nothing where only because somebody in the White House is asking us to be more engaged in defense issues, that this is the reason why Germany should do more. I mean, we have the French ambassador here as a guest in the room. I know that colleagues in France asked us how long Germany would be willing to make pictures when French soldiers are fighting. So this would be a very difficult cooperation when somebody always has to fight and another member of the European Union is only making pictures from helicopters. So first issue, that's something we should discuss among Europeans in our European interest. Second, what should be the German approach? I think I have my doubts that if Germany would invest every year 2% of its GDP in the German army, what maybe our French colleagues would think after 10 years. This would mean Germany would invest more than 80 billion euros every year in the German army. I think in the conventional part of the French army, France is investing about 45 billion euros. We do not know how much they invest in their nuclear part, but if you compare the conventional parts, I'm not so sure if everybody is happy, not at the first year, but after 10 or 15 years. So my proposal would be invest up to 1.5% in the German army and 0.5% in the NATO funds, which are necessary to finance the defense instruments in Eastern Europe. Because until today, only the United States is financing Eastern European NATO members and their defense capabilities. It would be a big surprise for our East European partners, for example Poland, if Germany would be willing to invest 0.5% of our GDP in the existing NATO funds. At the end, 1.5 plus 0.5 would be the 2%, but not only in the German army. It would be a strong signal to the Europeans that we are willing to take a responsibility for the security of Europe on our shoulders. Until today, they have the feeling that the last man standing when it really comes to difficulties, that's the US, not the Germans and not the French. And the Germans could do more in this direction. Ambassador
Gardner, your response.
Look, I agree with this. You know, Donald Trump pretends that he is the first president to have discovered the 2% threshold. Suddenly he has been pushing everyone. This is going on for decades. Obama has been saying the same thing, and with some success, by the way. But what I would say, a slightly different twist on this, is twofold. First, burden sharing is not just about defense spending. Let's be clear about this. It's about a lot of the challenges we face together. And in my book, it includes combating climate change. It includes dealing with immigration. And if you widen the lens to include other burdens, Europe doesn't come out so badly. I would argue certainly in the last 4 years, it bears more of the burdens for climate change and much more of the burdens, particularly this country, on immigration. But I'm not saying that defense spending is not important. Again, we need to widen the lens. It's not just spending more, it's spending better. I mean, it's so obvious. I remember looking at the statistics for Belgian defense spending in detail, and I hate to pick on Belgium, a country I love. I spent 6 years of my life there. The GDP is a little over 500 billion. It spends 1% on defense. Of that 1%, to be clear, we're talking 5 billion euros, 70% is spent on pensions and salaries, 30% on equipment. Now, someone sitting in the Pentagon looking at those figures will say, that's a rounding error. That's a rounding error in U.S. defense spending. That's why people are so angry. So it's spending better on common procurement and common systems and so on. So look, I agree with all of this. We have to do better, but we need to widen the debate.
Let's widen the debate to China and Russia now, which were mentioned at the very beginning. Mr. Gabriel, I'd like to ask you about relations with China and the potential opportunity that you see for coordination between U.S. and German and/or EU policy when it does indeed come to China. How can both countries be more strategic when right now they are so far apart on policy, and when Germany has very big interests there in the form of trade?
Yes, of course, because our situation is different to the US. I mean, the success model of this country is being the most open economy of the world. We have a degree of openness by far more than 90%. For example, the United States is below 30. China is 34. French is 60%. So the success story of this country is to be an open economy and to be an export-oriented country. It's not so easy to change the model of economic interests, but on the other hand side, of course, we see China for us is much more difficult than the former Soviet Union or GDR. I would not say the good old times of the first Cold War, but we had a fence directly in our neighborhood. We knew on the other side these are our enemies, and we had a bit trade exchange by gas and oil. But we had the feeling we are much stronger than they are, and at the end we will win. With China, it's much more difficult for us. There's no fence, and China is something like a frenemy, an economic partner. I would not say friend, but and of course, when it comes to political issues, to the idea of society, it's our antipode. So it's much more difficult to deal with them. What's the only way to do it? I think, of course, like Tony said, to bring China on the negotiation table of the WTO, but this will only be possible if the democratic industrialized countries would join hands. It's impossible, by the way, to do it for the United States alone. It's impossible for us, or even more impossible. But it would be possible if US, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand would have the same idea how to deal with China. And I think if you look to China, you can do two major mistakes. First, to underestimate China, but the second is to overestimate China. I asked myself, why the Chinese guys always have 2025 and 2030 at the year where they want to reach something? The reason is because from that time on, this country will have a massive demographic problem. They will have to invest in their own country, not in One Belt, One Road, in their own country, if they want to stabilize the country. So dealing with China means also to have, you can learn from China, you can learn strategic patience. And I would say we as the industrialized democratic societies and countries, we need these strategic patience, and we should rely on our own strength. But therefore we need a much closer cooperation between the US, Europe, and some others.
Ambassador Gardner, how should a potential Biden presidency approach the Europeans on closer cooperation, especially given the fact that, you know, he's inheriting now a situation where the United States is poised for conflict with China, where it's quite clear that, you know, Trump's efforts are not working when it comes to tariffs, when it comes to giving China pause with its assertiveness globally, be it in the form of Hong Kong, be it in the form of trying to influence reports here in Europe, or very aggressive language from their ambassadors. What would be the appropriate way going forward to form a common strategy, and would that be an advantage in pressuring China?
For sure, one of the few areas of true bipartisan consensus in the United States now is China. You know, never before, by the way, in decades, has there been such an alignment between the parties on any issue, and China is one of them. It's almost a bit worrying, because even in the Soviet U.S. era, there were hawks and there were doves. In the United States now, there are hardly any doves on China. They're almost all hawks. There is almost unanimity that China represents a real challenge, even a threat to, not an economic threat, but also a threat to human rights and democracy. But I agree, let's also not fall in the trap of being overly concerned with China. Let's remember, the model of not only one-party rule, but one-person rule, personality cult rule, has not been a very successful recipe in China. So I'm not overly concerned long-term, although we do face enormous challenges. Margaret Vestager, who is commissioner, obviously, now in her second term at the EU, said it very well. She said, let's not try to be Chinese. The Chinese are much better at being Chinese than we are. Let's be ourselves. Let's actually work together and insist on our values and leverage our joint strengths. So I agree completely with Sigmar. That means being clear-eyed about what's going on. We mentioned a few areas already, and forcing them to the negotiating table. And speaking up when it's necessary about human rights, not being shy, speaking up for freedom of navigation, speaking up as well about the importance of defending Taiwan and so forth, but returning to the old policy of one China. You know, I think we can find that balance again, which we had. Without being enemy, without being a friend, we work with you where we can and we should, but we will be clear-minded where we need for you to change. Last thing I'll say, I don't think it's too naive to believe the Chinese are now becoming a status quo power, that it's in their vested interest to make sure the system actually works properly. Because if it doesn't, they also lose. They lose from this. They've benefited from this world trading system, but it has to be fixed.
You mentioned bipartisan support. That's something that's rare in Washington these days. Sure. But it's also present when we talk about Nord Stream 2. How long will that continue to be a thorn in the side of transatlantic relations? What does a Biden presidency mean for Nord Stream 2? What does it mean for sanctions?
Well, Sigmar, I'm sure you have views. Look, we had concerns under Obama. We expressed the concerns. I don't think this is an entirely economic project. I think it is strongly motivated by political concerns. But that does not mean that an ally should lecture, threaten, bully another ally, in this case Germany, or write letters to certain ports that are involved in this project threatening sanctions. I don't think that's the way. I think it's for Europe to decide. Poland has been outspoken, amongst others. I think, unfortunately, we've seen rifts and divisions as a result of this project, but it's close to being completed. The real question is, will this project undermine Ukrainian energy, not only not independence, but ability to earn 2 billion euros of transit fees, and what it means for the Ukrainian economy going forward? What is the solution if Russia decides to completely skirt Ukraine and simply deliver gas without Ukraine directly to Europe? That's the number one question for me. And second is the diversification of supply routes and types of energy to Europe. That is in our common interest. So my short answer is very different language. Unacceptable to be bullying and harassing an ally on this issue. This is a European issue principally.
I think I know what you're going to say on Nord Stream 2,
So then
Mr. Gabriel.
You can answer for me.
No, but I'd like to ask you, what signal do you think, or does Germany need to send a signal to its international partners that it's really
Why
serious?
Germany? I mean, now the United States is just debating a new sanction act in the House, and what was the reaction? I think 24 of 27 European member states went to Washington by their ambassadors and said, that's not the way we should work together. It's not a German project. Second, at the very core of the debate is what Tony just said. Do the Americans accept that whatever will be the outcome of the decision, it's a sovereign decision of Europe and its member states? And that's the question, should you use secondary sanctions against allies? Coming to practical proposals, how to deal with this, going back to the year 1980, there we had sanctions opposed by the United States government against the Mannesmann-Röhren deal, which was another pipeline. And Reagan was president, and George Shultz, he was Secretary of State, went to Reagan and said, look, Mr. President, we have so many issues with our European allies, especially with the Germans. At that time we debated about NATO and on both sides the mid-range nuclear weapons. It's not the best idea to concentrate on one single issue and to come into a big conflict about one single issue, this pipeline. Let's broaden the perspective and let's have a look which kind of energy cooperation we can have between the Europeans and the Germans and the United States. And the President Reagan, who, 1980, this was not Ronald Reagan who was negotiating with the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. It was the President who came into office and said, these are the home of the devil in Moscow and in the former GDR. And he lifted the sanctions because he said it's in our national interest to broaden the perspective and not to be concentrated on one issue. I would say the Germans and the Europeans should offer the United States a much broader energy cooperation than we did before. First, why we do not cooperate in the question of hydrogen. I mean, if we want to reach our climate targets, we will have to reduce the gas consumption for heating, for example, by far less gas than we are using today. Second, of course, diversification on the energy side. We need LNG terminals. By the way, in the past, they were not possible if they should work market-based. I think we will need public spending to finance the LNG terminals in Western Europe. And the third, we have competitive ideas, competition ideas among the East European member states, the Three Oceans Initiative of Poland and the Baltics, which is, of course, a competition with Russian gas, but fine. It's in our market interest. So I would say there are rooms for maneuver, and there is common ground to compromise if your perspective is not concentrated on a very narrow conflict.
We've been talking a lot about the tough spots in the transatlantic relationship, and I'd like to just rewind for a minute, go back in history, and talk about when the transatlantic alliance really came together, when it was strong. It had a common enemy. It had a common goal. You know, it was countering the Soviet Union. Does the transatlantic alliance need a common enemy again? And are there opportunities there with regard to Russia and China? Ambassador Gardner.
I wouldn't put it that way. You know, you're right that the origins of the European Union started with the European Coal and Steel Community that was a response to a Soviet threat. I don't think we need an enemy, and certainly we can't define China as an enemy, and we certainly shouldn't force Europe to choose between us and the Chinese. But I think I would define it differently. I would say, how do we maintain our joint relevance, in the 21st century, economically, politically, and otherwise? And that's the narrative. I think you were asking, maybe answering a different way. What's the narrative that can inspire and organize our work? And so I think it's that.
Mr. Gabriel, your response, and then thereafter I will open it up to questions, so feel free to approach the mic.
I totally agree.
That's all.
That's all.
Fantastic.
That's a kind of transatlantic partnership.
I'll bring in our first question. This is coming in from online. The EU seems to be keen to act with more digital ambition nowadays, achieving European, for example, digital technological sovereignty has become a key political driver from the viewpoint of both those who are on stage. How does this fit into the worldview of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, respectively? Mr. Gabriel.
I mean, the future of transatlantic relations under a second term of Trump, I cannot see any future of. Then we only can try to survive. Unfortunately, I would say, normally the Europeans should not need a difficult American president to be more united, to develop a common foreign policy, for example. But maybe this will push Europeans in this direction. But I don't hope that we will need a very bad experience with our strongest partner in the world to be aware what's necessary in the European Union. Under Biden, we discussed it. I think it's not jumping back to the good old times, but jumping forward. And I agree to what Tony just said, because I think it's not only to of course we have an enemy. Sometimes we have it in our own society, all the authoritarian ideas, the shrinking room for democracies in the world. Of course, it's not a country, but it's a philosophy in the world which is our enemy. On the other hand side, we have many ideas in common which are universal: the freedom of speech, the rule of law, the individual rights. That's also it's not only something against somebody else. It's for a very specific idea what human beings are, and what they're right to do because they are human beings. And I would say this is still today the strongest fundament for our transatlantic cooperation.
Ambassador Gardner, your view on this, and I'll bring in the words of Ursula von der Leyen, of a more geopolitical European Commission. How do Trump and Biden view that? How does that fit into their worldview?
Well, look, Donald Trump is one of the reasons why those words have become central to the new European Commission: sovereignty and autonomy, because the EU looks at the world and says, it concludes that it's a dangerous place where the United States and the Chinese are playing hardball, and the European Union needs to defend and promote its interests around the world. So do I think it's legitimate that democratic sovereign countries, proud countries, should protect and seek to protect and project their interests. Absolutely. I hope that those programs don't change from protection to protectionism. But you know what? Like you, we've seen this debate so often. I lived through it when I was in Brussels in the 1990s, Fortress Europe. It didn't happen. It didn't happen, and I don't think it's going to happen now. We can get into the details, but even on whether it's financial payments, which I follow, or online platforms, we can criticize some of what's going on. But is it fundamentally appropriate and needed for Europe to have control over its destiny? I think it's absolutely appropriate that, yes. Is it appropriate that European citizens should know how their data is being used, the impact of certain companies' online platforms have on the democratic system? Absolutely yes. Is it correct there should be more accountability and transparency of certain digital companies? Absolutely yes. Should we be working together to ensure that we know what's happening inside the black box of algorithms that spit out a lot of decisions? I think it's appropriate, without forcing companies, of course, to reveal highly sensitive information. So let's be careful in what we say about, sovereignty and autonomy is somehow necessarily means European looking inward and protectionism. No. But the devil is in the details.
And by the way, I'm totally against the idea of autonomy. I think we should be strategic sovereignty, but not autonomy. That's too close to the idea of bowling alone. I think we will need each other in the 21st century, and as Europeans we need our own to develop our own capabilities for being strategic sovereign, but I don't want to be to come into a strategic autonomy. By the way, I don't think that all the European member states would be happy with this idea. There are some member states who agreed to the German unification because we had a strong alliance with the United States, because they were afraid that maybe this big German bubble in the middle of Europe could be a new center for difficulties, and because there was a strong relation between Germany and the United States, at the end they agreed. So I'm not so happy with the idea of strategic autonomy. And it's not only a question of words and connotation. Strategic sovereignty is something different to the idea of autonomy. I don't want to see Germany or Europe trying to bowl alone in this difficult world.
Mr. Gabriel, I've been told I think you might have a train to catch. So I'd just like to ask you, if you have the ability to answer and the time to do so, who do you expect will win next week and why? And what are your final thoughts?
It will be something very astonishing that I'm hoping that Joe Biden will win. And I think, of course, if you look to the conditions of this election campaign, it's much more in favor for the Democrats than for Trump and a party who was former the Republican Party. I think that's what we also see, that he changed completely the structure of the Republican Party, and I think the conditions for Joe Biden are much better than they have been during the previous election campaign for Hillary Clinton. Yeah. Crossing fingers.
Ambassador Gardner, before I ask you that final question, I just want to bring in one more that has come in from the audience because it's quite interesting. Regarding the relationship of U.S.-China issue, how would Biden's White House ratify the relationship with China?
Sure.
Thank you. A round of applause, please. So, I'll begin again. Regarding the relationship of the U.S.-China issue, how would the Biden White House ratify the relationship with China while keeping the collaboration with Taiwan and protecting it from being invaded, given that President Xi has become more aggressive on Hong Kong and also Taiwan, the Taiwan cross-strait issue recently?
Well, this is not reinventing the wheel. You know, we were there before Trump. I think part of that aggressiveness, I think it's the right word to use, is due to the fact that Donald Trump has undermined the understanding that used to exist, that there is one China, and he has sent very high-level diplomats to Taiwan. Early on in his administration, he took a phone call, as you remember, from the president of Taiwan, et cetera, and engaged in some very aggressive language with the Chinese leaders. Just a few examples, and of course, the trade war and sanctions. So, you know, it's not naive to think that we can go back to what existed beforehand and saying we are committed to the defense of Taiwan, but we're going back to the understanding that China, you know, that there is a one China, and while pushing back as we have before on the issues you mentioned, right? So it's not reinventing the wheel.
Interesting. I'll ask you the same question that I asked Mr. Gabriel. Who wins next week?
2016, you know, I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. I was going to stay in Brussels. We know how that movie ended. I don't trust the polls entirely, although they've improved. More importantly, I think we're not committing the errors of 4 years ago in the key swing states. Of that, I'm pretty convinced. I'm worried, as I mentioned, about some turbulence, potentially some street violence. I hope I'm wrong. I'm cautiously optimistic that Joe Biden will win.
You served under Clinton, you served under Obama. Would you serve under Biden?
I'm happy doing what I'm doing.
Have you been asked?
No. Look, of course, no one's been asked. We haven't won an election yet, you know. And by the way, of course, even before January 20th, no contacts with foreign governments whatsoever, absolutely banned because of the reasons of the Donald Trump. When he entered, he started negotiating with foreign governments before he was in the White House, absolutely off limits. So first, let's win an election, and then we can talk about all those things.
Finally, this is really the last question. What are your hopes for the transatlantic relationship?
Look, first of all, 2 sentences. Repair the damage, which is not enough, of course, but it'll take up a lot of bandwidth. Repair the damage, eliminate some of the things that have been done. The first day, by the way, I think we'll have Joe Biden with executive orders invalidate all of the Trump executive orders that invalidated Obama's executive orders on climate change. Day one, on methane emissions, landfill emissions, power plant emissions, on fuel standards. Day one. And second, I mentioned a few things we can do either day one, first 100 days, that will change the mood music. But the last thing, last sentence, that's not enough. We have to build something, not just clear the wreckage. And that's going to be the big challenge.
Ambassador Gardner, thank you so much. The book Stars with Stripes, if you guys want to read more.